Trusted Advisor is a tool that we can access, right? And just by reading the description of Trusted Advisor, optimize performance, improve security, reduce costs. Doesn't this sound like a lot of the pillars of the well-architected framework? Not exactly all of them, but I think all of these checks that the Trusted Advisor service will do for you ties back into one pillar or another with the well-architected framework. What are the top features you see here? Cost optimization, performance, security. Those are three pillars right there. But also fault tolerance that kind of peaks into reliability, right? Also service limits. And we need to be aware of how many, let's say, S3 buckets we have out there. And S3 is a storage service, and an S3 bucket is a storage location. There may be a limit. I think there was a major increase on that limit, by the way. It used to be that you can only have 100 buckets per account. Now it's 1 million buckets. But you might run into that service limit. Who knows? You might run into that 1 million buckets. I think they got released in reInvent this year.
Yeah.
So Trusted Advisor as a solution, if we just go ahead and click that, we should get a screen that kind of pops up to give you some general information on Trusted Advisor. And as we look to this account, we want to use this page to get an overview, right, of the different checks that we can go into. And here are the checks that you will see as you consider Trusted Advisor. Performance. Let's see what it says about performance as a Trusted Advisor check. All right, there is a high risk issue for performance efficiency here. And I'll tell you how I got this. I use the well-architected framework tool. Yeah, there's a tool. We showed you the documentation, and that's nice. I like the documentation because I need to read through it to understand the tool. But as I go into the tool, and maybe this is a good opportunity to do it now, right? So as I go through the tool, the well-architected tool, what we will see is that I get a chance to evaluate my architecture based on those different pillars. Those checks relate to those pillars like we talked about. And so I got 33 workloads, and some of them are just test workloads that I built out. But if I jump into any one of these, and I'll choose this one because we haven't really evaluated that, and I know that based on this 0 that just popped up next to this 57. And let's make that a little bit more clear, right? If I go into app 1 as a workload, and let's back up a bit, I'll have a way to review this with the well-architected framework. I'll choose that button. What do I get now? Take a look at the left side of the screen, folks. I get all of those 6 pillars. And what we didn't do, we didn't dive into the well-architected framework very vigorously, I would say. We just did an overview of the pillars. But if we did a deeper dive into those pillars, you would notice that in the documentation, there are several questions in relation to the pillar. So you would use the tool to ask your team members. There will be a meeting that you would go into in consideration of the workload that you build. And you would ask your team members as a subject matter expert or a sponsor of that event, do we follow best practices? The documentation has the question. The documentation also has the answers or the best practice that you would choose to follow that question, right? Or answer the best practice question here. And so the first question says, how do you determine what your priorities are? It's of the operational excellence pillar. And the first statement that we talked about when we considered the well-architected framework was that as a system administrator or a cloud administrator or a cloud ops professional, right, you need to sit with the stakeholders to understand the ideas that need to be created. So the first question is, how do you determine what your priorities are? And that's a part of the operational excellence pillar. What you would do then is you would say, if you evaluate external customer needs or not. If you do, you would hit that checkbox. If you don't, you would leave it blank. So as we would go through the process of evaluating our workload, we would say yes or no to these best practices. And I got a high risk issue in my Trusted Advisor portion of my account because when I hit next to go to the next question, it saved all of those inputs. And I would continue this process around the questions that are important to me in my workload or all of these questions. But when I get done with this thing, and let's say I hit save and exit this time instead of next, it's going to point out the questions that I answered. Right? I answered 2 questions, and I didn't choose every best practice to be a part of those questions. So that means that I have work to do. And so I see the usefulness now of this tool, right? I'll have an opportunity to say, you know what? I got some high-risk issues here. If I scroll down far enough, I can expose those high-risk issues. Is this really evaluating my account and all the services that I have running my account? No, there's a way that you can do that. I think that's a topic that's deeper for what we're talking about now. But this is just evaluating the answers that we gave. And based on those answers, like the first question, how do you determine what your priorities are? Now there's some recommended improvements. And it's not hard to find these recommended improvements. It's only the best practices that we didn't choose. You need to choose it so you can optimize this area of the business. And in this case, we need to optimize our business a little bit more to evaluate internal customer needs because we didn't choose that as a best practice. And when I clicked that link, guess what it did? It sent me directly to the white paper so that I can understand what the question is about, so that I can understand what anti-patterns I might be conducting myself considering this question, what level of risk this is if I'm not following the best practice. And then the sweetest part about this is, how do I overcome this? I get some implementation guidance. And notice that the question is not very technical, but some of these other questions are technical. And you would have a technical way of implementing that guidance here, right? Depending on the questions that you go through. You have an opportunity to learn, right? You have an opportunity to get this thing done the right way. You just have to know where the tools are. And I think that was the biggest thing for me. I didn't know where to go at one point. And somebody reached out to me and called me one day and said, hey, you haven't tried this with AWS. And it started my journey, right? And so hopefully the conversation that we're having now, right, can start that journey for you.
Sounds great. What I love about this, what this takes me back to in the questions is where we all tend to see these, whether it's a benchmark, a standard, a security control, a requirement. And I've mentioned NIST cybersecurity framework. I've mentioned Cloud Security Alliance. I've mentioned FISMA, PCI. All of these checks and balances are there as guidance, right? Sometimes they're hard requirements, depending upon what workload or what sensitivity of your workload is and the criticality of your workload. But it's all to help guide and secure the data, hands down, no matter what it is. And sometimes it may take a little bit of work. It may take a little bit of lifting. But the reality is that it's not just you as an individual person doing it. It is a collective of your team. It's a team effort where you can share out some of these controls or share out some of these segments and collaborate across your organization to understand how things are being maintained, how things are being monitored. One of the gotchas across, I probably would say, my 2025, now I'm going to date myself, my 25 years of my career has always spanned around logging and monitoring. No matter what organization, no matter where I'm at, the issue fundamentally always comes back to storage of your logs. Who's maintaining that? Because it's costly, right? And so we'll talk about how S3 and the benefit of S3 and the benefit of intelligence tiering helps in being able to maintain that from a centralized perspective as well. We'll talk a little bit about security as well as we get into storage in a few weeks as well. But we want to leave you with this sense of saying, number one, you understand how to create your free tier account. Number two, you understand where you can go and look to see what's the guidance, where do you need to start, what do you need to uncover or understand about what you may see already. That's going to be with your well-architected framework, whether it's the documentation or the tool that's in the console. Also, where you can check and evaluate, as I said before, your own concierge, your own cloud security concierge, if you think about it that way. Yeah. This is the value of Trusted Advisor, where I've had the experience of where I've seen organizations that had never even opened it, never even knew that it was there, never even knew that it was something that was available to you as a user or customer on the AWS platform. And they were leveraging other third parties. And there's nothing wrong with that. Checks and balances is important to understand where other vendors may help support you, but who better to evaluate your organization or evaluate your environment than the company that you're actually working with or working on their platform, right? It just makes sense to me.